Hey y'all, Southern Style Gaming here, and today I'm going to talk about something that I've just found a little interesting, something that, I think just recently I've sort of noticed a parallel between these two games. One of them is Halo 3, which is my second favorite game of all time, and the other one is The Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time, and I've just found a sort of interesting parallel between these two. So, to sort of set this up, I'll just say this. Back in the day, back in like the early days of the internet, the early well, I guess not necessarily the early days of the internet, but like back when it was really first starting to get popular, back when platforms like YouTube were first starting to come onto the scene, and you actually saw people like discussing video games at large. This was back before, even before the days of like Screw Attack, the Chaos Theater and stuff like that. And the common consensus at the time, back in the sort of early to mid 2000s, the almost completely consensus opinion is that The Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time was the best game ever made. And even people who didn't necessarily agree with that opinion, they still said, hey, Ocarina of Time, objectively speaking, is one of the best games ever. So, this was an opinion that was seen across the board. And, it was sort of getting a little overhyped. So, everybody just kept saying, yeah, Ocarina of Time, best video game ever made. Objectively, one of the best ever. All of this stuff. But then all of a sudden, sort of in the late 2000s, we started to see this shift in opinion. And all of a sudden, almost as a sort of backlash to this idea that it was the best game ever made, we started to see public opinion change and say, well, no, it's not the best game ever made. And now it's considered one of the most overrated games ever made. So, all of a sudden, a bunch of people were jumping on this bandwagon that, hey, Ocarina of Time is really overrated. It's not really that great of a game. There are some parts of it that have aged poorly. This idea, of course, at the time, there were still a lot of people that considered it the best game ever made. But, slowly, public opinion of the game started to change. And it went from being the best game ever made to the most overrated game ever made. And then, all of a sudden, things sort of swing back in the other direction. Probably around the early to mid 2010s, we start to see things sort of go back, and people are saying, okay, it's not the best game ever made, but at this point there are so many people calling it overrated that you can't really say it's overrated anymore. And to be honest with you, I've seen recently sort of that same thing has been happening with Halo 3. So Halo 3 had so much hype behind it at launch. Like, it was crazy. I mean, you had to be there to experience it. Like, it was so insanely hyped. Just everybody was waiting on it. People were chomping at the bit. It broke all kinds of records on release. And of course, many of those records would be broken literally a month later by Call of Duty 4, but still, at the time, it was a cultural phenomenon.
What the heck was that?
And for that reason, especially among a more casual crowd, I'll admit, even though, I wouldn't call myself a casual gamer. Honestly, I kind of don't like that phrase to begin with, because, I mean, where do you really define the parameters of a casual? But besides all that, I still think it's a great game. Like I said, it's my second favorite of all time. I'm not going to pretend that, it's objectively a top 5 game ever made, because it's not. It's got its issues. Its writing falls short in a few places. It could have had a bit of a better campaign, but I absolutely love the game. And again, I think part of that just comes down to the fact that, it was a finale for my absolute favorite trilogy in gaming. So, I'm going to admit I'm very biased here. But, at the time, the general consensus was that Halo 3 was one of the greatest games ever made, because it actually accomplished the impossible. by building up this unimaginable hype. I mean, possibly the most hype that any video game has ever had. And it still somehow managed to pretty much exceed expectations. Like, it somehow managed to do that. And, to this day, it's remembered for that reason. That, there was just so much hoopla around it. And it still managed, most people still walked away very satisfied with the game. Like, they weren't let down by it. And many people did say the game was even better than they thought it would be. Which is crazy, Like, most of the time, when you see a game come onto the scene with as much hype, anywhere near as much hype as Halo 3 had, it's usually a letdown. So hype has always been considered a dangerous thing when it comes to video game releases. But Halo 3 met that hype and in some ways exceeded it. But then, in years following, much like Ocarina of Time, public opinion started to change. People started really pointing out the flaws in the game. They started pointing out the flaws that, Miranda's death was kind of stupid, The Arbiter, he's really not written that well. And I'll straight up say that might be the worst thing about the game, because the Arbiter is my favorite character in the Halo series. And I do think it's kind of a shame that he was basically just written to be Master Chief's sidekick throughout the game. That much does suck. There are a couple of lines in there that are also really cringy. That line at the beginning of Crow's Nest that's like, the dude is asking Miranda, hey, squads are wanting to, they need a rally point. And Miranda's just like, to war. Everybody knows that line was really bad. But still, I do not think these really go above the level of nitpicks. I think that these things are absolutely nitpicks. I still think overall the game plays really well. I think the sandbox is about as well-rounded as any FPS we've ever seen, between the equipment, with the weapons. Things just felt, not quite as finely tuned as Combat Evolved, but I'll give it a pass because the sandbox was more expansive. So, there were more things to play around with. You could have a lot of fun with a bunch of different weapons. So, overall, I still think the Halo 3 experience was absolutely fantastic. I don't think there's much to complain about. Like I said, the things I do think you could complain about, I think they're nitpicks. I still think overall the game is an outstanding experience. But, again, like I said, the general consensus on this game, a few years after it started to come out, people really started to point out its flaws. And so, this is where people really started to say, hey, Halo 3 is, really overrated. And over time, this narrative is kind of built up. People Halo 3, it's really overrated. They started comparing it to other Halo games. A lot of people have gone as far as to say that Halo 3 is actually the worst Halo game, not just in the original trilogy, but the worst Halo game made by Bungie, which I absolutely cannot agree with. I know this is a very unpopular opinion, and I could probably make a video on this topic alone, but I actually think that Halo Reach is the worst Bungie Halo title. Now, I have my own personal reasons for this that I'm not going to go into in this video, because like I said, I could give that topic its own video. But just know that I'm not that fond of Halo Reach. I think the multiplayer is really fun. I don't like how the campaign is. And yes, it does have to do with the book. But anyway, I think that Halo 3 has now kind of reached that same sort of tipping point that Ocarina of Time has. In the way that, at this point, so many people consider Halo 3 overrated that I don't think you can fairly consider Halo 3 overrated anymore. I think that it's sort of tipped the scales. I think that a lot of people have actually sort of jumped over to Halo 2 which, in my opinion, is only marginally, but Halo 2 I actually do think is the worst game in the original franchise. And to be fair, that's mainly because of the tuning. I think Halo 2's tuning, especially on Legendary, is genuinely awful. You know, I know a lot of people are going to say, oh, that's a skill issue. It's not really, but again, that could be its own video topic. But then again, there have been too many videos done on that topic anyway, so I'm really not even going to touch it. But yeah, I think that Halo 3, its sort of life cycle has basically mirrored that of Ocarina of Time. You know, I think that these two games actually do have quite a lot in common in that way. That, you know, they sort of came out, you know, they were very popular. Popular opinion was that, hey, it's one of the best games ever made. And then, all of a sudden, you know, the public just kind of, like, turned against the game and started calling it overrated. But now, it seems like, you know, it's sort of finding a middle ground. That, you know, Halo 3 is finding the middle ground, just like Ocarina of Time did, you know, some time ago, where, you know, there's some people on one side of the fence that still say it's one of the best games ever made. There's some people on the other side that say, you know, oh, it's so overrated. And then, you know, most of us now kind of just sit in the middle and say, hey, the game's not really overrated. It's not, you know, objectively one of the best games ever made. It's just a really solid game. It's really good. You know, it's still up there in that upper echelon of games in both cases. But, you know, its reputation has become that of an overrated game to the extent that you just cannot call it overrated anymore. Not reasonably, at least. And I'd throw another game in the mix here, one that I'm not as intimately familiar with, and that's Final Fantasy VII. I feel like it basically went through the same life cycle, where, you know, at one point it was just such an overhyped game, and then, you know, the general consensus is that it was just so absolutely overrated. But I think the difference is that Final Fantasy VII became much more of a meme than Ocarina of Time or Halo 3 ever did. So that's why I kind of didn't want to include it, because, one, I've played Ocarina of Time and Halo 3. I've played both of these games quite a bit. I've never played Final Fantasy VII. You know, okay, I take that back. I've played like a little bit of the beginning of it. And, you know, I don't want to say it's a bad game, but I just could not get into it. Like, it wasn't for me. So, which is really funny, because I actually got into Final Fantasy VI. I actually really enjoyed Final Fantasy VI, which technically it's Final Fantasy III, but, you know, whatever. But yeah, I wanted to make a video about this topic. I thought it was pretty interesting. You know, I do think that those two games, their life cycle basically mirror one another. And just tell me what you think about this. You know, tell me if you agree, if you disagree, leave a comment. Tell me what you might want to hear me just ramble about next. I hope y'all enjoyed it. God bless, and have a good day. Tell me I don't have any more flying to do.